Eugenics is a set of beliefs and practices aimed at improving the genetic quality of the human population. Historically, this is done by excluding certain groups of people who are thought to be inferior by those who subscribe to this set of beliefs. When it comes to the application of eugenics, one of the most famous examples would of course be Hitler and the Third Reich. But you might be surprised to discover that the inspiration behind many of Hitler's methods during World War II was none other than the founder of the American taxpayer-funded company Planned Parenthood. So, who was the real Margaret Sanger? And if she's really the cultural icon that modern-day politicians have dubbed her to be, why did the Third Reich call her the greatest socialist in America? Hey y'all, I'm Christina, and you're listening to History and Hearsay. Margaret Sanger was born in New York on September 14th, 1879. She is idolized as an iconic feminist and a champion of women by many left-wing groups due to the work she did in popularizing and legalizing birth control methods in America. She founded the American Birth Control League, which later became Planned Parenthood. And from the very beginning, Margaret was a very controversial figure with her disturbing views on eugenics, race, and population control.
In the eyes of some, Margaret Sanger has been a heroine. In the eyes of others, she's been a destructive force.
In 1916, Sanger, along with her two sisters, opened the country's first birth control clinic in New York. 9 days later, the police raided the clinic and arrested everyone involved for promoting birth control because during this time, birth control was illegal in the United States. Sanger refused to pay the fine and spent 30 days in jail. Once her jail time was behind her, Sanger traveled the country preaching her concepts. And in her own words, Sanger pushed for a society that limited births to those she deemed fit to have children.
Well, I think the greatest sin in the world is bringing children into the world that have disease from their parents, that have no chance in the world to be a human being, practically. Delinquents, prisoners, all sorts of things just marked when they're born.
As a member of the American Eugenics Society, she advocated improving the genetic composition of humans through controlled reproduction of different races and classes. She often wrote about this issue in the journal she founded, which was called the Birth Control Review. And in 1919, she wrote,
I personally believe in the sterilization of the feeble-minded, the insane, and the syphilitic. The most urgent problem today is how to limit and discourage the over-fertility of the mentally and physically defective.
In 1921, Sanger founded the American Birth Control League. As proof of Sanger's sinister motives, many of Sanger's critics like to point to an interview that she did with the New York Times in 1923. In this interview, she referred to people as weeds.
It means the release and cultivation of the better racial elements in our society and the gradual suppression, elimination, and eventual extirpation of defective stocks, those human weeds which threaten the blooming of the finest flowers of American civilization.
Hayden Ludwig, an investigative researcher, has extensively studied Sanger's life and writings.
She talked about the need for race betterment through controlling these weeds, basically undesirable people.
In 1927, Sanger endorsed the decision in Buck versus Bell in which the Supreme Court ruled that states could forcibly sterilize people deemed unfit without their consent and sometimes even without their knowledge. This American law ended up being a major piece of the defense used after World War II for the Nazi doctors who practiced Sanger's methods during the war. And as a result of this defense, many of them were found not guilty. In 1939, after opening another clinic in Harlem, Sanger launched what she called the Negro Project, which was an initiative supported by Black leaders such as civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois. Critics claim the program used the pretense of better health and family planning for poor Blacks in the South as an attempt to limit the Black race. Part of this plan was to have Black doctors performing on Black patients to perpetuate the sterilizations of Blacks who were deemed inferior. This was done because many Black patients were suspicious of white doctors, rightfully so in those days. So this plan was put into place with the intention that patients would automatically be more at ease and more open to treatment from these chosen doctors who the patients saw as part of their own community. Ludwig says that modern-day supporters of Sangers grapple with her past and how to interpret her legacy.
They know when she writes about human weeds, they know that it's repulsive. They know it's disgusting. The left will never abandon Margaret Sanger because if they do, she's the foundation of so many of their views.
Sanger even shared her vision for a preferred race at a women's branch of the Ku Klux Klan, even writing about it in her autobiography.
Always, to me, any aroused group was a good group.
Despite those views, many politicians who claim to care about the Black community still praise Sanger's work while ignoring her history.
Admire Margaret Sanger enormously. Her courage, her tenacity, her vision. I am really in awe of her.
Ryan Bamberg, founder of the Radiance Foundation, says abortion proponents are working to clean up Sanger's past and what she stood for.
They have to reinvent her every time they talk about her in order to justify their celebration of her.
Former Planned Parenthood director Abby Johnson says those inside the abortion industry are trained to overlook Sanger's racist views.
They give you an answer like, well, I mean, yes, Margaret Sanger was a racist, but everybody was a racist back then. You accept it because she is your hero and she has to be your hero. You cannot question Planned Parenthood.
Margaret Sanger was one of the few women to be given an honorific title and inducted into the Ku Klux Klan. She was also exalted by none other than Adolf Hitler and Dr. Joseph Goebbels. Margaret Sanger's racism, anti-Semitism, and violent suggestions on eliminating all non-whites from American society is, of course, what endeared her to the eugenics crowd in the first place. And it's reported that Sanger's theories and opinions directly influenced prominent Nazis such as the SS captain known as the Beast of Auschwitz, and even Hitler's own personal physician. In 1934, the Nazi Party adopted her radical positions, with Dr. Goebbels saying, "Margaret Sanger is the best National Socialist in America." On September 15th, 1935, Dr. Wilhelm Stockart and Dr. Friedrich Kritzenberger, sorry you guys, I'm terrible with German names or pronouncing any unusual names, so I apologize in advance. I've looked up and I know how to pronounce them, but I still say them wrong. These two doctors drafted up the Reich Citizenship Law and the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor. These laws classified races according to a ridiculous chart and embodied many of the racial theories that were prevalent in Nazi ideology. These laws would also provide the legal framework for the systematic persecution of Jews in Germany who at that time were deemed a race and not a religion. And when Hitler authorized the Eitan T4 euthanasian program, which was his program to murder handicapped, mentally ill, and other undesirables from German society, the doctors and nurses who were participating in this program were given the program directly from Margaret Sanger's own philosophy. As I mentioned earlier, Sanger was always a controversial figure who had many critics and supporters, and many of those who currently still support Sanger's past work claim that she condemned abortion, arguing that it would not be needed if every woman had access to birth control. But what they leave out is that Sanger really only opposed abortions if it meant not producing the best, healthiest, most intelligent babies from Caucasian couples. For Blacks, Jews, and brown-skinned people, as well as white people with low IQ or birth defects, well, those undesirables were not to be allowed. And this disgusting belief is what the Nazis adopted into their practices. On August 18th, 1939, the Reich Ministry of the Interior circulated a decree requiring all physicians, nurses, and midwives to report unborn infants and children under the age of 3 who showed signs of severe mental or physical disabilities. Dr. Carl Brandt founded this program, opened facilities disguising them as children's clinics. They advertised that these clinics would treat children for abnormalities and infirmities, but in actuality, these facilities were death centers where the children were quietly killed, and then the cause of death would be misrepresented as pneumonia, tuberculosis, or some other such illness. Dr. Brandt himself claimed that Sanger's methods were most effective, and if performed correctly, were ingenious. If you go back and read some of the first editions of Sanger's writings, you'll find that she peddled racism, eugenics, contraception, and abortion, and many believed that Sanger's writings clearly demonstrate a hatred for children, parenthood, marriage, and the Catholic Church. By 1942, in a large part due to Sanger's work, birth control was no longer illegal for married couples in America, and building on Sanger's eugenics platform, disguised as giving women access to birth control, the American Birth Control League changed its name to Planned Parenthood Federation of America. In the early 1970s, Planned Parenthood's push to fulfill Margaret Sanger's goals was helped greatly by the Supreme Court's decision in Roe v. Wade.
In 1997, Stephen Mosher of the Population Research Institute wrote about the push to repackage Margaret Sanger in the Wall Street Journal.
The reason I call it the repackaging of Margaret Sanger is because after the Nazi regime destroyed the legitimacy of eugenics forever, they then went back and said, oh, she was just an early feminist. She was just an early supporter of family planning. No, she wasn't. Now, she was a supporter of giving IQ tests to people. She was in favor of using those IQ tests to determine who should be sterilized and who should have children.
In a response titled The Demonization of Margaret Sanger, Alexander Sanger, her grandson and president of Planned Parenthood at the time, called Moser's editorial unfair. In the same piece, Esther Katz, director of NYU's Margaret Sanger Paper Project, claimed that she had evidence revealing
Sanger did not rationalize her support for birth control on racist grounds, that she never advocated genocidal policies aimed at racial, ethnic, or religious groups, and that she, in fact, believed access to birth control would benefit, not eliminate minority populations. Dr. Katz turned down our request for an interview, although in this article, the editor as public authority interpreting Margaret Sanger, she wrote, by our current highly sensitized standards, some of her attitudes and statements can be construed as racist, elitist, ethnocentric, and not politically correct.
Dan Gaynor of the Media Research Center says that Sanger's true mission remains alive and well throughout today's abortion industry.
Look at the maps. See where the abortion facilities are. They are near places where people are marginalized, people are poor, people are minority, and that's their target market.
Because of allies in the media and academia, Gaynor also points out how speech from conservatives and others about Sanger's past, Planned Parenthood's practices, and abortion is often classified as hate speech.
There is nothing as close to a sacrament in the media as abortion. It is a holy writ that abortion is protected. And anybody who comes out against it, any organization, any business, anybody, the media swarm.
The problem also exists on many college campuses.
I remember at Harvard, they laughed when I was talking about the history of eugenics. And they said, that doesn't matter. Planned Parenthood is not like it was during Margaret Sanger's days.
Those who oppose Margaret Sanger's views say not true and are committed to exposing her past for future generations.
Under the veil of secrecy and deception, 60 plus million babies have not been born because they were aborted legally since 73. 1/3 of that population belong to the African American community.
So if you are curious about where I'm getting all of this information, as I know different news sources contradict each other about Sanger's beliefs and what her actual motives were, I'll have my sources all linked down below. And I mentioned earlier reading the first edition of Margaret Sanger's autobiography because it's believed that some of the later ones have kind of been edited to make her opinions or beliefs come across as not quite as radical as they actually were. When politicians hail Margaret Sanger as some champion of women's reproductive rights, they always fail to include her genocidal positions on ethnic cleansing. The following are some quotes directly from Margaret Sanger's own writings and interviews.
The most merciful thing that the large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it. A marriage license shall in itself give husband and wife only the right to a common household and not the right of parenthood. All of our problems are the result of overbreeding among the working class. Knowledge of birth control is essentially moral. Its general, though prudent, practice must lead to a higher individuality and ultimately to a cleaner race. Blacks, soldiers, and Jews are a menace to the human race. The masses of Negroes, particularly in the South, still breed carelessly and disastrously. with the result that the increase among Negroes, even more than among whites, is from that portion of the population least intelligent and fit. Birth control appeals to the advanced radical because it is calculated to undermine the authority of the Christian churches. I look forward to seeing humanity free someday of the tyranny of Christianity, no less than capitalism. It now remains for the United States government to set a sensible example to the world by offering a bonus or a yearly pension to all obviously unfit parents who allow themselves to be sterilized by harmless and scientific means.
Margaret Sanger died on September 6, 1966. 9666. But unfortunately, Sanger was not alone in her beliefs. The late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said in a New York Times interview, "Frankly, I had thought at the time that Roe was decided there was concern about population growth, and particular growth in populations that we don't want to have too many of." In an Elle magazine article, Ginsburg also stated that poor people should have ready access to abortions because it makes no sense as the national policy to promote birth only among poor people. In 2015, out of $1.29 billion in total revenue, $553.7 million came from the government reimbursing Planned Parenthood for their services. In 2020, Planned Parenthood performed 383,460 abortions, the highest number of abortions that has yet reported in a single year. And that was an increase of nearly 28,600 from the previous year. And in the United States, the abortion rate for Black women is almost 5 times that of white women. While for many years, Planned Parenthood has denied its dark history, in more recent years, they've been forced to distance themselves from their founder. And in July of 2020, Planned Parenthood quietly removed Margaret Sanger's name from their headquarters in Manhattan, New York. Due to its lack of grounding in constitutional text, history, or precedent, Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022. This change means that abortion will no longer be considered a constitutional right in the United States, and any regulation on it will need to be sorted out in the state legislature. As for Margaret Sanger, her legacy is one of death, as in the last 50 years, more than 60 million babies have lost their lives in the pursuit of profits and with the hopes of controlling the population of undesirables.